Hello and welcome to another video in the Simplified opening series. In this video we will take a look at the King's Indian defense, obviously one of the most popular openings in chess, and we will take at some modern developments that I think even a few years ago would have been looked at with quite a bit of a shock by King's Indian practitioners. So things change, everything changes, and well, some moves that would have been considered really bad in the past nowadays are actually quite playable. So let me show you what I have in mind. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3 castles, bishop e2, e5. So far everything normal, right? I mean, we are getting for the classical variation of the King's Indian defense. And here white has a choice. They can go for the Petrosian variation with d5, or the Gligoric variation with bishop e3, or the exchange variation with d takes e5, but the most classical move obviously is the move short castle. And here comes the moment where modern players, heavily influenced by modern engines, started playing a move that at first sight appears like a complete waste of time. And that move is the move h6. Now, you probably know that the main moves are knight c6, the Mar del Plata variation, which lately doesn't seem to be kind of very much liked by the top players. It appears that, well, as in the whole King's Indian, there is simply no attack, more or less, and white even learned how to deal with these kingside advances and the general problems of black's position after d5 knight e7, which is this position of the knight on e7 being not that great, and the lack of space, the bad bishop, turns out to be the more important factors. Obviously there are other moves. There is e takes d4, actually a very good way of playing the King's Indian nowadays, after both knight d4, rook e8, yeah, attacking the pawn on e4, and after f3, now both knight c6 and c6 seem to be doing quite all right for black. But this is obviously a different type of playing the King's Indian without going for an attack. And there is also the move bishop g4, which I actually recommended in my King's Indian Simplified for my Chessable course on the platform. And one again, I was actually influenced to check this move by after Fabiano Caruana used it in one of his games. And then, of course, I noticed that the engine also very much likes this move. So Caruana was influenced by the engine, I was influenced by Caruana, and there you have it. You have a whole Chessable course on this move. And another move that's also kind of, I think, very shocking, but we will not look at it this time, is the move b6. I mean, I'm pretty sure if somebody showed this to Geller, Botvinnik, Petrosian, and all these greats from the past, they would have just laughed and would have probably sent the player, the person suggesting this move just to find another job. But nowadays, actually, the move is, well, playable, I would say. And even like, because developing the bishop on b7 in the King's Indian was always considered like a lack of understanding, because after d5 the bishop is bad on b7, but it turns out that black can get away with loss of time and drop the bishop back to c8, and then this barricade of b6 a5 on the queen side does slow down white's advance. To make it even more interesting, the move b6 is actually have been played more than once in the Fianchetto variation by Pragnananda and other strong players, so maybe we can take a look at this in another video. But in the meantime, you can check his games in the Fianchetto variation with the move b6. But in this video, like I said, we'll look at the modern move h6. The move covers the g5 square, so it's kind of a waiting move. And it in a way, black's making a semi-useful move. The knight can come to h7, the king can come to h7. Yeah, g5 is covered, and waits to see how white will react. So in this position, there are more reactions by white. Two are about resolving the tension in the center by taking on e5 or pushing d5, and the other two moves are about keeping the tension with moves like bishop e3 or rook e1. And so we'll take a look at all of these moves. So in case of d takes e5, d takes e5, the exchange variation here is quite acceptable for black, simply because there is no bishop g5 idea for white here. So let's say exchange of queens, rook d8, knight d5, knight d5, c d5, c6, it's easy equality for black. There is no bishop g5 to harass the rook, so black is perfectly fine. Even keeping the queens after, let's say, bishop e3, knight c6, this is fine for black. There is control over the d4 square, and black can simply develop, let's say, rook e8, bishop e6, and so on. So this is fine for black, nothing really concerning. Another move that releases the tension in the King's Indian is the move d5. And as a general rule, I remember this when I was learning about the King's Indian when I was a kid. Well, the general kind of recommendation for white playing against the King's Indian was to kind of try to keep the tension in the center. And in fact, fixing the center is in black's favor. And I think this rule still holds true. So especially as fixing the center kind of makes black's play much easier. So d5, already the center is fixed. And now before starting some kingside activity, this is the way modern engines like playing these positions for black, is to take care of the queenside first. So a5, not immediately knight h7, f5 or something like that, but a5 first. So stopping b4, knight e1, knight a6 now. So this is the kind of, again, modern way of playing the King's Indian, where black does not abandon queenside to its fate and just hurl everything, the kitchen sink and everything else on the king side, hoping for a mate, but rather taking a more prophylactic approach and controlling white's play on the queen side. As a side note, I would like to say that I wrote about this in my newsletter, my Substack. You can check it out above. Yeah, I wrote about this, that actually Bobby Fischer, when he came back from retirement and he played this training match against Gligoric, his treatment of the King's Indian was quite similar to what the engines do today. He was kind of pretty positional in his approach, trying to control the queen side, and also one of his favorite themes was the exchange of the dark squared bishops. So he was often going h5, bishop h6, for example, to exchange, or simply activated the dark squared bishops, thus aiming for positions where he would be without bad pieces. So quite interesting, yeah, that Fischer was, again, ahead of his time. And here, after, let's say, knight d3, b6, just completes the control over the queen side, because the knight and the pawns really make it hard for white to advance. And now that the queen side is safe, black can try and play on the other side. Let's say bishop e3, knight c5 now, attacking e4. And if f3, knight h5 already, the king side advance is coming with f5, and we have a typical King's Indian position here, which is perfectly fine for black. The other two moves are more tricky to deal with, and nowadays the main move is the move rook e1, standard move for white, keeping the tension and preparing for some bishop f1. But before that, we need to check the move bishop e3, and in fact this is a curious transposition to the Gligoric variation arising after, I'll just quickly go back to move 7 after bishop e2, e5, bishop e3. Yeah? And now in the late 80s and the 90s, Grandmaster John Nunn came up with this very interesting move, which is the move h6, preparing knight g4. Because before that, knight g4 obviously was played a lot, but this allows bishop g5 and so on and so forth. A lot of theory. So he came up with the move h6, controlling the g5 square and threatening knight g4. And white here usually played castle, and we have a transposition to the line we are looking at. Yeah. So basically the positions that were played in the late 80s and the 90s all of a sudden make a comeback through a completely different move order. Yeah. So knight g4, following Nunn's idea, there is no bishop g5, bishop c1, and now knight c6. Obviously, it's possible to drop back to f6 and ask white if they want to draw. But let's just say we're in a combative mood, knight c6. Now going for the Mar del Plata idea. d5. And now, I mean, there is a choice, in fact, here for black. The main move would be knight e7. But this is knight d4. Actually, it's quite a sharp move that you can try for yourself. You can explore this. It's not entirely correct. With best play, black ends up pawn down with some compensation, but I think it's worthy of a practical try, as it can get very confusing for white. Yeah, so you can take a look about this, on this variation, as it's kind of curious to try it out. So the line goes knight d4, e4, knight b5, queen h4, threatening mate. Yeah, and now the best move is bishop f4, and so on and so forth. So you can check this yourselves. Yeah, but knight e7 should be better. Yeah, and now again I'll just show two possible ways white can go. Obviously the knight shouldn't move from f3 to go to e1 or d2 to attack the knight on g4, and then after knight d3 to support c5 or knight c2, and then to activate the knight via e3. We will see both of these ideas. So let's say knight d2, attacking the knight, f5, defending the knight, and now wanting to go back to f6, so bishop g4, fg4. And what we have is a really peculiar pawn structure for black on the king side, where there is not an obvious pawn storm, but there is an open f file and access to the f4 square, especially with moves like g5, knight g6, and knight f4. So this was, for example, played in the game Gelfand Nan from 1991. b4, a5, ba5, rook a5, knight b3. And now best would have been to go back to a8, rook a8. And after c5, we get to see another modern treatment of how computers like to play these King's Indian positions. In the past, and that's what Nan did, for example, he didn't put the rook on a8, he put it on a6. And would be just to concentrate on the king side, maybe go g5 and so on, and not do much on the queen side. But modern computers actually are very concrete, and they don't mind taking on c5 here, for example, and after knight c5, b6. So engaging white on the whole board. Yeah? And the point of the move is that now knight drops back. Okay, knight e6 doesn't bother black much. I will explain that in a minute. But knight d3, knight f5 is the great idea. Trying to jump to d4 or going back to d6, and ef5, e4 ensures that black regains the piece and obtains counterplay here. Both knights are attacked. And if knight e6, take on e6, d takes e6, you can exchange queens, rook d1, c6 covering the d5 square, and this is objectively fine for black. Yeah, some endgame, that pawn on e6 can easily be lost, so it's objectively fine for black, even though it remains rather sharp. So that's knight d2. Whereas Garry Kasparov, when he faced this line with white, he went knight e1, and after f5, take on g4, fg4, he now played the move knight c2. So he wanted to put the knight on e3. Yeah, in a way a prophylactic measure, because he was anticipating g5, knight g6, so the knight can control the f5 square. And here the computer again comes up with a very peculiar plan for black, an improvement. Nan obviously played g5 and then planted the rook on f4. It was a complicated game that ended in a draw. But the computer actually prefers a different plan and starts with king h7, knight e3, and now h5. So the idea is again not to weaken the f5 square and activate the bishop via the h3 square. And again, we see a positional way of treating the King's Indian, trying to improve the pieces, not just go kind of gung-ho for an attack on the king side. And again, this is pretty unclear. So that's the old, in a way, old new line of the Gligoric system with h6. So now let's turn our attention to the main move, rook e1. And here it's funny that modern players treat this position in different ways, even though I'm a bit confused, let's say, by the move order, in fact, because a lot of players here would play knight d7, yeah, or c6 or knight a6 and so on. But then I'm confused, why wouldn't they go knight d7 or c6 or whatever instead of h6? Why h6 first? Yeah. So I thought, okay, let's find a way to make h6 useful. So one idea is to go knight h7, yeah, which is kind of peculiar. You can take a look at it yourself. But what I discovered was actually a couple of games actually by strong players when they played knight c6. And I think this is quite interesting because now we're getting into some sort of Mar del Plata after d5 knight e7 with the moves h6 and rook e1 included. So who gets to gain from this inclusion? Yeah, well, as always, it's both pros and cons. For example, what black achieved was that now the one of the main lines with knight e1 is no longer possible. Yeah. But on the other hand, okay, the h6 move still being useful covering the g5 square, but on the other hand, h6 is not always useful, even though, as we will see, because it weakens the g6 square and so forth, a little bit the light squares, but as we will see, the computer finds ways to make it useful. So here, again, different moves for white are possible. We will take a look at a few of them. Even though what makes most sense after rook e1 is to go b4, because in the Mar del Plata variation without rook e1 and h6, after b4, knight h5, rook e1 is the main move. So useful move in the bayonet attack with b4. So we will take a b4 as the main move, but we can also take a look at other moves. And one, for example, I would like to show you where one very important tactical idea for black is shown. And in this case, the move h6 is actually a vital part that idea works. So let's take a look at the move knight d2, common move for white in the King's Indian, a5, stopping b4, let's say a3, knight d7, rook b1. This is actually quite a common way of playing without rook e1 and h6 with the move knight d2. So f5, b4, knight f6, yeah, all standard stuff. Bishop d3, okay, covering the e4 square. Let's take ab to open the a file, and now comes the tactical idea. King h7. You would say, what's the tactical idea? There's no tactical idea. The king is just getting to h7, and why are you putting the king on the same diagonal as the bishop? But the idea is actually a prophylactic one, and it's a typical trick for black in these positions where the move king h7 is an important preparatory move. Let me show you. In case of c5 now, which it's the natural move for white, dc5, bc5, f takes e4, bishop takes e4, and knight ed5. And this is the idea for black, to actually use these knights to take the pawn on d5. We will see also another version of this idea of getting the king away from the vulnerable diagonal, a2, g8, and then taking the pawn on d5. I'll show you that in another variation as well. So let's check now the move c5, which is the most direct one, immediately engaging black on the queen side, knight e8 now. And the idea is if cd6, knight d6. As a King's Indian players, you probably know this idea of actually recapturing d6 with the knight, which is a very good place for the knight. Yeah, targeting e4, going for f5, and so on. Even though c6 playing the center is also possible. So b4. And now the move c6 is also interesting. You can take a look at it yourselves. It's probably a little bit worse for black, but perfectly playable, I would say. But f5 obviously is the critical move, yeah? Knight d2, covering the pawn on e4. We have something similar from what we looked at, yeah? Knight f6, yeah? And now, again, many moves for white. Taking on d6, playing f3 after f4 leads to a typical King's Indian fight. Let's say a4, g5, knight c4, knight g6, cd6, cd6, knight b5, knight e8. Standard King's Indian stuff, covering the d6 square and going for an attack with h5, g4. Yeah. This is something that we would, I think, all enjoy on the black side of the King's Indian. And note that the bishop is actually on c1 and not on f2 to target black's queen side. But let's check the move a4, and now again king h7. A very important idea. Yeah. The point is, if white continues with bishop a3, we get the same trick. Take on e4, cd6, knight, let's say, d takes e4, and now knight ed5. Now this is the key idea. Yeah. So both knights are under attack, but whichever knight white takes, black will recapture the other one. And black, obviously, having eliminated that pawn on d5, has no problems here. And now you understand why the king needs to be on h7, because with the king on g8, black would lose after bishop c4, pinning that knight on d5. So keep in mind this idea in these positions. So instead of bishop a3, actually white should take cd6, cd6. But now the same idea still remains. Take on e4 and take on d5. Let's say b5, take on e4, knight c4, knight d5. And black is fine. Bishop f1 is a bit better, trying to eliminate that idea. So f takes e4, knight e4. Now knight e4, bishop f5 is a kind of a positional way of continuing. But I would like to show you another positional idea here for black, where he obtains good play. So b5, rook c8, bishop a3. It appears that black is in trouble. That pawn on d6 is attacked, but bishop takes e4, rook e4, and h5. And it transpires that even though white has the pair of bishops and black exchanged the important light squared bishop, black doesn't really have problems because the bishop is activated via h6. d6 is no longer an issue. The knight can come to f5, maybe d4 later on. So all black's pieces are well placed. White's additional bishop, the light squared one, is not very active, and black has no problems here. So a very nice way to extinguish white's initiative in the center. Whereas here, instead of bishop f1, if white goes f3, then we go for the assault. f4, knight c4, g5, knight b5, knight e8. Yeah, defending the pawn, and then going h5, g4, knight g6, yeah, and so on. Maybe knight g8, knight f6, depending on circumstances, obviously. So typical King's Indian attack. So interesting ways to take advantage of that h6 move. Yeah. Now let's take a look at the move before, the bayonet attack, a5, ba5, c5. This is a common way of playing the bayonet attack for black. Then here the h6 move again comes in handy. It's interesting to note that the engine heavily favors white in these positions, but they are typical King's Indian positions that actually who plays them better will win. So a4, take on a5. Let's say rook a3, standard move for white. The rook is quite good on the third rank, ensuring against any far-fetched attacks, let's say, because there won't really be an attack here. So knight e8, bishop d2, rook a6, queen c1, attacking the pawn on h6, king h7. Yeah, and now bishop d1. Now this was played in the game Giri Nakamura, played last year in 2024, and for example, the way Nakamura treated the position was interesting, even though it showed also the dangers that black is facing in these positions. So I will show you how that went. He went bishop d7, bishop c2, b6. So Nakamura is playing very solidly, trying to keep solid on the queen side, and not being very quick with the possible f5. Because after f5, e5, g5, the bishops are looking menacingly towards the king side. There are ideas like knight h4, maybe the knight can come to b5, the rook can swing maybe to the king side, and things can be a bit tricky. So Nakamura is quite cautious here. But this is not without danger. So knight b5, knight c8. And the idea is to go knight a7 and try to challenge that knight on b5. He uses the knight from e7 because the knight from e7 didn't really have any prospects, whereas the knight on e8 remains there to cover the d6 pawn. So g3, bishop h3, knight h4, knight a7. And now, after knight c3, knight c8, they actually repeated moves and the game was drawn. So knight b5, knight a7, and the game was drawn. But in fact, after king h1, it turns out that white has these very nice prospects on the king side, preparing a possible f4. So for example, going f5 is not good for black, e5, g5, knight e2, and like I mentioned, all these pieces are looking towards the king side. f4 may come, yeah, f3, g4 is another idea. Okay, the knight will probably have to leave h4, so things are not so good. I think here the engine was giving already +4 for white, which is massive, even though not immediately obvious. There is also the threat of knight g1 going after the bishop, so things are not great for black. And for example, bishop f6, trying to get the knight g2, bishop g5, trying to exchange bishops, runs into f4. And again, black is in trouble. So these are the dangers that black can run into if he's way too slow with kingside play, like Nakamura did. So f5 is actually better and much more natural, I would say. And after e5, not gf5, because knight h4 is tricky, and then f4 can come, and I mean the center comes under some sort of trouble. But taking with the knight, and then the knight is going to d4, yeah, knight b5, knight d4. So this is again, the engine would say white is better here, And objectively that may be so, but what looks like is a typical standard King's Indian position where black really has the only weakness on d6 well covered, and otherwise it's quite solid on the other side of the board. Yeah, I mean, the king side is very well covered. The bishop can come to f5, maybe the knight can be activated via f6 and so forth. So a standard, I would say, typical King's Indian position with chances for both sides, obviously. Yeah, and these are the let's say the recent discoveries you could say I made when I was looking over this little h6 move, and yeah, it adds this kind of scent of freshness, of novelty in the so well explored positions from the classical variation of the King's Indian. All right, so I will wrap up this analysis. If you're interested in my content, you can check out first my courses on Chessable. I mentioned the King's Indian Simplified, but also many others. You can also subscribe to my Substack. You get a weekly newsletter on chess thoughts, chess ideas that sent to your email every Saturday. And of course, if you like my channel, make sure you smash that subscribe button. I hope you do so that every week at least you get these kind of pretty good instructional videos. Hope you like them, hope you enjoy them, and you learn from them. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon again. Cheers.